there. I'm Samantha Redondo, a licensed therapist and embodiment coach, and you're listening to the Spiritual Embodiment podcast. I am your host, and I am delighted that you are here, that you're listening, that you're curious about this topic of spiritual embodiment. And so I wanted to take the time as we get started to really share my heart and bits of my story of why spiritual embodiment? Why is this the theme with a plethora of therapists, mental health experts, professionals, healthcare clinicians, doctors out there talking about mental health, sharing on podcasts, sharing on social media? Like, why do I need to add my voice to the mix? And why about spiritual embodiment? And I think for me, this topic feels so fascinating. One, because it lands so closely with my own story of embodiment and spirituality being such massive themes throughout my life, and ways that I have made meaning of my experiences, ways I have actually found myself in situations that were not aligned with me, that were harmful to me and even traumatic to me, and ways that I have found my way back to truth and authenticity and a sense of grounded purpose that feels really aligned with my values and how I want to live my life. And these two threads of spirituality and embodiment, I have seen weave so effortlessly throughout my life as resources, as ways, kind of like frameworks to fit my experiences into. And where those things meet, this intersection of spirituality and embodiment, is something I'm just fascinated with. I think it really speaks to how we make sense of the world, how we make meaning, the parts of us that know there's something bigger than us, even if it's just like the collective reality of all of humanity, of the more than human world that we're a part of, this web of all life. That's really what I think about when I think about spirituality. And for some of you, that might mean, your sense of God, or what happens after we die, or a particular belief system or value system that really does give you meaning and purpose and feels organizing to you. And how that intersects with our real life lived experience every day of being a body, and how sometimes we kind of lose that in spirituality, or those things can get disconnected, and a whole plethora of chaos and dysfunction and toxicity can come when those things are disconnected. And so I just think this topic is absolutely fascinating. And something that I see in my personal story so strongly, but also that I get the privilege to see as I work with clients. And I think that's another reason why I wanted to start this podcast, is I get to hear the stories of people from all walks of life, all experiences, all ages, genders, where they kind of had these shared moments of experience that seem to align with this intersection of spiritual embodiment. Maybe it's been something harmful or traumatic that's happened to them in a spiritual environment, in a religious setting, that then caused them to become disembodied, caused them to put away parts of themselves that didn't align with the values of this space, of this community. And that really affected them and changed the way that they saw themselves and lived their life from that point on, until maybe there was a reckoning or a moment of realizing, whoa, this isn't who I want to be or how I want to be in the world. Or maybe even they went on a spiritual journey and there was a sense of seeking and exploring things outside of what they had previously known. And that was correlated with an embodied experience, with this kind of awakening and realization of the reality of what it means for them to be a body, to be fully embodied, and how those things impacted each other. There's so many examples I could name of how this intersection of spirituality and embodiment comes up for clients, and how we get to work with it together, that feels really clarifying, feels really organizing, feels really relieving to have some language and almost like vision around how these two can kind of interplay, these two big topics that often on their own can feel hard to grasp, hard to name, hard to define, which we will definitely get more into definitions in this podcast as we go along to help us have some like skin in the game, tangible, something to put our hands on while we talk about these really kind of ethereal or hard to pin down notions. And, I think because of that work with clients and then getting into my own story around these themes, I've seen what power this intersection of spirituality and embodiment has, and how beautiful when we are intentional in these spaces, when we're thinking deeply about how our spirituality impacts our embodiment, how our embodiment impacts our spirituality, and how those things impact the whole of our lives and even our collective life as humans, as a culture, as a society, as, a part of a certain type of community, whether it's our locale, our religion, our race and ethnicity, our family, our people that we feel connected to. Embodiment and spirituality are kind of the ways we make sense of our existence in these spaces and in these power dynamics, which we will talk more about today. So, I wanted to start out just by naming, like, yes, I have a degree. Yes, I have a license and letters behind my name, but I am not an expert on spiritual embodiment. I am truly on this learning process with you all, even though I have training and expertise that can, make me legitimate to see clients and work around these issues. There's so much research and study and thought that has gone into both of these arenas that even if I spent my whole life pursuing the study of these things, I would not be able to read all the research. I would not be able to absorb and really process and understand all the philosophy and theology and, different religions of the world, different flavors of spirituality, to understand it all and have this definitive expert opinion about it. And so I really wanted to name that from the get-go that, I'm coming at this as someone who is learning, discovering, growing, transforming with all of you. And, I have a bit of experience and a bit of understanding in my back pockets that can hopefully help us create a framework for how to look at spiritual embodiment. But by no means am I coming at this trying to be the end all be all expert on these things, because I know they're massive topics and I have even just scratched the surface of my learning about these things. But it does make me really excited and really curious to unpack some of these bigger ideas and interactions with you all and with some of the guests that we have coming on the podcast. And so I just feel very inspired by the people in my life, other therapists and experts and researchers that I just have the privilege of knowing. And in conversations we get into about these themes and these topics that I'm interested in, I'm just amazed at the wisdom, the experience, and the expertise that comes out of these people that I happen to be connected to. And so I'm so excited for you all. If you do stick around and continue listening to the podcast, I have some really great guests in the queue who, we've already recorded actually some of the interviews, and it's just, I'm amazed at their brilliance. I know they're my friends, but I'm just so excited for you all to get to hear their opinions, their experiences around spiritual embodiment and how they've made sense of their own journey, and how that meaning making, how that process for them is connected to the broader human experience that I think we can all glean from and learn from and feel inspired by. So I think another piece of my why behind starting this podcast is recently, there's just been a lot coming to light. I'm recording this in early 2026, and there's a lot coming to light around leadership and power. And so, I'm located in the US, and within our political systems, within government, within business and the marketplace, and within religion and church spaces, we're seeing a lot right now of things coming to light, things being revealed. The people who we thought were the good guys are actually the bad guys, and the people in power maybe don't deserve to hold that power. And I think what that's shedding light on for me as I look at this intersection between spirituality and embodiment, especially when it comes to this happening within church and religious spaces, is how dangerous disembodiment can be in a power dynamic. And so in this current cultural moment, what's coming up for me as I think deeply about spirituality and embodiment is how our spirituality and the embodiment of that, or disembodiment connected to it, impacts all of these other areas of life. And I think especially in the US, where borders between church and state are becoming blurred, especially when it comes to power dynamics of who holds the power, how these religious organizations, even though they're supposed to be separate from government, separate from politics, kind of have their fingers and have their influence in a lot of politicians, lawmaking, things that happen in the nation, a lot of it without us knowing, a lot of it under the surface or in back rooms. It's an important time to recognize that spirituality is much more than like our personal preference of how we see God, how we kind of organize our thinking about meaning in the world. But it shapes our collective values. It shapes our vision for the future. It shapes who we associate with and relate with, who our enemy is, who we protect, who we dismiss, who we think deserves to have power, who doesn't deserve to have power. And when we're living in a disembodied way, our spirituality is divorced from, is separate from our true here and now lived life as a body, that can get really dangerous. We can be promoting people and ideas and values that actually go against our innate humanity, that maybe even go against another person's humanity. And I think this exploration of spiritual embodiment not only gives us a room and a space to explore these themes in, but it actually gives us some common ground and legs to stand on when we're thinking through these really tricky power dynamics that, for me and a lot of people I know, feel really overwhelming right now. It feels hard to know what's up and what's down, who's right, who's wrong. It can be really confusing, really flooding to our nervous system and emotions. And so having practices around integrating our spirituality and embodiment together help us to organize and make sense of some of these really big issues that we're having to think through in this day and age. I wanted to name too that one of my other reasons for starting this podcast is related to, like I mentioned earlier, my own story, especially when it comes to spiritual trauma. And talking about spiritual trauma is kind of like trying to hold sand. When we've experienced trauma in these spaces and in these communities, it feels like when we're naming it, it's constantly slipping through our fingers. It's getting in our mouth and eyes, like when the wind blows sand at you, distracting us from the work at hand. And I see this in myself at times. I've seen it with clients where a lot of these things happen so collectively and so subversively. The power dynamics, the gaslighting, the ways we become disembodied in these religious and spiritual spaces, that it feels like the water we're swimming in. And so it's invisible. It's hard to see. It's all around us, and it has been for so long. And then when we get out of these environments, sometimes there's things in culture, there's things in a community, there's things in our society at large that have similar power structures, have similar dynamics. And so they do feel invisible and icky and subversive and can be kind of under the surface and hard to name. And so especially when spirituality was closely woven into our development, it's like this continual struggle to define ourselves apart from these realities, while also integrating spirituality as a core part of who we are. And so I think this is something that really interests me, excites me, and deeply, impacts my own story. As we think about these things, is like, it's the both and of this, of like these things being so important to talk about and so slippery to talk about. That's brought me to the work of this podcast. So said another way, how can we be spiritual in a way that's deeply meaningful and personal without our spirituality being the culmination of our identity and personhood? So that's what I'm here for. That's what I'm excited about. That's what I'm interested in starting this podcast. And I hope you'll come on the journey with me. I hope, some of these big kind of elusive topics don't scare you away, because I really value, as a person and as a therapist and coach, making things practical and doable. So I think one of my skills is being able to take these like kind of big esoteric, big picture ideas and distilling them down into like smaller, bite-sized, synthesized, palatable thoughts, action steps, strategies, rituals that can help us to actually live into these maybe like bigger values or bigger organizing structures that we have found helpful. And I really think that is what kind of the picture also of spiritual embodiment is taking the big esoteric phenomenological ideas and realities that are organizing and help us make sense of the world, and distilling them down into a way, connecting them into the earth, into our bodies, into practices that help us to feel the reality of our lived experience every day, which is the work of embodiment. And so we can define more terms as we go along, but that's really kind of to paint a picture of what this podcast is. It's like that funnel, of these big ideas, these big picture things, and then funneling into kind of the more practical lived experience, everyday life, be in a body that we really need. We really need that connection to, I think, show up as full humans. So another layer of this that I want to name too, I named some of these bigger picture power dynamics happening in the US, happening in religious spaces. But, I'm recording this in early 2026 and just wanted to name, like, there has been some truth brought to light about organizations that I've been a part of, specifically Christian religious organizations that I learned from, that I volunteered with, that I was a part of the community for years, and eventually was on volunteer leadership in some capacities there. Namely, the organization is Bethel Church in Redding, California. And there's been some recent scandal things coming to light about different pastors and leadership. And really this idea of cover-up culture, that some of the leaders were covering up, sexual immorality and promiscuity among the staff that was non-consensual and very inappropriate for the position this person was holding. And also years-long deep deception around ministry and prophetic words, and really just emotional manipulation on so many levels, from the pulpit, from the stage, from people who were promoted and given global platforms and told that they were to be trusted by leadership there. So I wanted to mention this because part of this podcast for me is an extension of or an outgrowth from my own journey of spiritual deconstruction, of healing from spiritual trauma and harm, and kind of reorganizing, what I think about spirituality, while at the same time being on a journey of healing my relationship with my body, of practicing embodiment, of exploring what it feels like to live a more embodied life and be more present in my embodied experience. And so this podcast is an extension of that work for me. And so it feels very timely that I'm recording this first episode in light of these things that are close to my spiritual trauma getting kicked up for me, because I'm actively having to practice what I preach in a way, or practice what we're exploring here, as these stories become more public and as it's in more of the collective consciousness of these people who have had positions of power, can't be trusted, aren't safe, aren't good. And these systems that have promoted them, that have protected them, actually aren't good and safe for people either. And, to be fully transparent and honest here with this community, and I was a part of perpetuating those systems. I was on leadership in some capacity. I was, a part of their schools and mission trips and things like this. That was selling the product, that was promoting Bethel in some way. And a lot of that, whether intentionally or not, was incredibly harmful. And so, something I'm seeing as I'm listening to these reports and more things coming out, witnesses coming forward about some of these leaders, I'm also seeing it kind of resonant with some of the political, leaders, the truth that's coming to light, namely the Epstein files, things that we've known, we've heard, we've believed the stories, but now there's receipts, there's hard proof that a lot of this stuff was true, unfortunately. And we're reckoning with that. I think one of the things I'm seeing with the church having these similar power dynamics come to light is when our spirituality is disembodied, we lose a part of our humanity, or even we could say a sense of our humanity. Embodiment is really what connects us deeply to the reality that we're human. It connects us to the core of ourself, that we know our personhood, we know our selfhood when we're embodied. And so what I'm seeing in a lot of these leaders is this reality of being in a system that divorced spirituality from embodiment, and what that might have looked like to make it more clear or more plain is, expecting leaders to not need help, expecting leaders to perform at a level that was actually humanly impossible, to keep expanding and getting bigger and better and more impressive, and speaking to bigger crowds and having more impressive or awe-inspiring gifts over time, versus having seasons of expansion and then seasons of contraction, or maybe not being as public or not performing to this level. And I think there was a lot within the theology of these spaces too, where the body was seen as a vessel or an instrument, or even as bad. It was maybe a vessel for our spirituality, a vessel for our eternal soul, something that God would use to move through, to heal, to show his glory. Particularly, I get more into this in future episodes, but particularly in the charismatic church, through physical manifestations, which, are honestly very dehumanizing. There's this experience of your body kind of being taken over, and used in a way, honestly, without consent. And so back to my point is, so when our spirituality is disembodied, we lose our connection to ourselves. And this can also look like losing our connection to our intuition and discernment. And a lot of the stories coming forward from witnesses in this Bethel situation, which I think is similar when we look at politics, when we look at what's coming out in the Epstein files, all of that, is many of these victims and these witnesses didn't feel right about this leader. It didn't feel good. There were things that were off. But there was so much messaging in these systems and in these religious spaces of, oh, you're just being too religious, or, oh, you need to honor your leader and like just trust us. Oh, that's your own judgment. You need to put that aside. That really diminished people using their own intuition and discernment to know what was best for them and what felt safe and good for them in that moment. And because they kind of systemically were taught to distrust themselves, which I've worked with a lot of clients on. I've worked on myself, for myself, on this mistrust of self, distrust of self that comes from growing up in a lot of these spiritual spaces. They ended up in situations that became actually very harmful and traumatic because they didn't listen to those cues from their body, those very human, innate cues of, hey, watch out, like the hairs on the back of my neck are sticking up, my hackles are coming up, like, oh, I don't trust this person, I'm clenching my teeth, I'm feeling like I want to run away. Those very subtle but also very true impulses from our body, the wisdom of our body to know when we feel safe and when we don't, were overridden by these belief systems, by these spiritual messages. So I'm forgetting her name right now, but I will include it in the show notes. But the author of Cultish, which is a fascinating book, talks about the way that religious systems and cults will kind of use control and manipulation to shut down questions, to shut down people using their own discernment if it's going against what the leader or what the organization wants you to do, is this idea of thought-stopping cliches. And so what that means is, like, one really common one we can think of is when a man does something that is violating, is inappropriate, is like not okay. Someone will say, well, boys will be boys. And it's just this cliche and this kind of colloquialism that dismisses the behavior, that is essentially saying, like, yeah, your opinion doesn't matter, your fear, your, intuition doesn't matter because, this thing over here is what's true. And a lot of times this works, when people are in these situations and they hear these thought-stopping cliches, they're like, oh yeah, I guess I am judgmental, or I guess I do just have a religious spirit, or I guess I am just not spiritually mature enough to understand these leaders' choices. And it really separates us from our own body's wisdom, of our own, core self and intuition. And so in this disembodiment of spirituality, we also lose autonomy and power. And so this is where some of those dysfunctional power dynamics come in, where people are disconnected from self, they're not in their bodies, and leaders are using, systems are using manipulation and control to have everybody fall in line, to have the community all believe the same thing. We lose our ability to choose for ourselves. And often this is one of the most kind of sneaky, subversive things. We hear about stories of cults or religious organizations where the control was really overt, and like, you couldn't make any decision for yourself. You couldn't leave. You couldn't, go on a date or go to coffee with someone without having the pastor approve it, or, having the leadership discuss it or know about it. But a lot of times in many of these organizations, it's a lot sneakier, and it might look a bit more like a leader questioning your choices. It might look more like messages of well, you need to pray about that. You can't just like make that decision. You have to like get a word from God or get a sign from God that that's the right thing. You need to submit yourself to leadership for them to give you discipleship about this issue. There's a lot of like spiritualized words that are used to make us feel like we can't be trusted, that we can't actually make the decisions for ourselves or know what's right or wrong for us. And so that is a way that we become disembodied. That disembodiment can show up in our spirituality as we lose our sense of choice for ourselves. And in disembodied spirituality too, we lose our connection both to ourselves but also to others. And I think, often when we think about these communities and why people stay for so long in organizations that are hurting them or even traumatizing them, there's always a question why survivors stay for so long. Why didn't you leave sooner? The moment that you got a ping that maybe this wasn't good. And I think, as someone myself who stayed too long, who knew the writing on the wall and tried to make it work, tried to figure it out. It is really, really hard to leave these organizations because so much of our need for belonging, which is an evolutionary, almost biological need, it's a life or death feeling for our nervous system to belong, because our ancestors, when they were nomadic people, living together on the plains, like if you were separated from the tribe, you were dead. You could not survive alone in those days. And so there's a part of that old limbic system for us, that survival system in our bodies, that if we feel ostracized from the group, if we feel alone, it activates that fight or flight, that survival response of I must fit in, I must be a part of the group at all costs, or I will literally die. Like that is what, even if our rational mind knows that's not true, I'll be okay. Our systems, those internal old ancestral evolutionary systems think that it's life or death, that experience of belonging. If I don't belong, I'm going to die. That's like the biological, physiological reality of the cascade of survival responses that happen when we feel like our belonging is threatened. And so when our spirituality is disembodied, often this belonging gets co-opted as a way of controlling us, as a way of getting us to buy into the things that we know aren't good for us, that we know aren't true. That's where kind of that cognitive dissonance comes in of like, I know this isn't true, but like they're saying I need to believe this or do this in order to be a part of the group, and I just can't handle not being a part of this group, or my happiness, my goodness, my security from hell, whatever the message is connected to this group. If I'm not a part of this group, I'm threatened in some way. And so in that, when our belongings being co-opted and dependent upon doing the right thing, being good, believing certain things, doing or saying certain things, we're not actually experiencing true belonging. We're not being seen for all of who we are and accepted unconditionally. We're having to do so much to stay connected to the group. And so these are some of the ways that disembodied spirituality can impact us, can harm us, can control and manipulate us, can keep us in situations that are unsafe or not good or even traumatic for years and years. And so on the flip side, when our spirituality is embodied, it connects us with our humanity. So there's some really cool research by Neva Peron, who's done a lot of research on embodiment when it comes to disordered eating and our experience of being a body when it doesn't work, when it does work, or when we are connected or we are disconnected from our bodies. And one of the really cool core kind of tenets of embodiment for her that she's found through her research is when we're embodied, we actually contain or possess a resistance to self-objectification, which I think to be said in another way, we're connected to our own humanity. You know, we're not allowing people to treat us as an object. We're not allowing people to see us as something that they can just use and throw away, or to manipulate or use in a way that we're not consenting to, or that is even harmful to us. And I think that truly is like keeping us connected to our humanity, that like we are a person with an opinion and a whole cornucopia of lived experience and thought and personality and so much goodness and depth, that, you know, we could never be treated like that. Like, I think one way that I like to think about how embodiment connects us to our humanity is with this idea of respect. Like, when I started embodiment work and really felt in an embodied place, like I'm connected to my body, I could not tolerate disrespect anymore. And not just in a way of like someone being rude on the subway or something like that, but when I was in a relationship where this person was treating me as less than human, where they were not respecting my boundaries, where they were using me for how I could benefit them and not considering how it was impacting me, oof, like that was not okay. I was so clear on like my hell no's, on my hell yeses, like, nope, like this relationship is not good for me. Like, I am cutting this off, or I am creating a boundary. And I think, you know, another way that embodiment connects us to our humanity is through pleasure, like through feeling into like what is so good about being human, what connects us to our aliveness and makes us feel like, oh yes, I'm living life. Like this is it. This is like why I'm here, what I'm for. And when we're embodied, we seek those experiences. Whereas I think disembodied spirituality, we often seek experiences that take us away from life, that take us away. Like, I want to numb out. I want to escape. I want to just be in fantasy land. I feel like that was a lot of my experience in Bethel, in this like extreme charismatic culture of like, let's just like go on these imaginal journeys to heaven, or like these like really long, overwhelming, emotional worship services that would go for hours, and we're just like praying and singing, and there was so much activity to like escape my lived experience, escape real life, and just be in this hyper spiritual kind of fantasy world. And so embodied spirituality really can be a way that we stay connected to our humanity, and also connects us to our common humanity. When I'm connected to my body and I can see myself clearly as like this human person who's trying their best and has their limitations, but also has really beautiful gifts and brilliance, I start to see the people around me like that too. I start to have more grace for their failures, their shortcomings, their, you know, ways that they're vulnerable and maybe their trauma is showing up, or a younger part of them is showing up. And also I'm able to see their brilliance of like, wow, your gifts and strengths and talents are so different from mine and so needed by our collective, by our community, versus this disembodied way of seeing people as objects of like, how can you serve me? How can you serve the bigger vision? Like, how can we use you? Which, gosh, so much of that language in these cultures, like, God wants to use you in this way, not like, wow, you have these really specific, beautiful gifts, and like, how do you want to use them? Just even saying that, there's so much freedom in that autonomy and choice that in these organizations that are more disembodied, we don't see. And so additionally, embodied spirituality helps us use our body's wisdom and discernment. So we talked about kind of the opposite of this, of like how disembodied spirituality keeps us from that discernment and intuition. But when we're embodied, kind of like I was just saying about those boundaries and those disrespectful relationships, like We feel our body's cues when we have practiced embodiment, practiced listening to the sensations and the cues in our bodies. We know now when something doesn't feel right. Like you can feel a no in your body and you can feel a yes in your body. And a lot of that is like not because of our conscious thought that we're like, what do I think about this decision logically? It is an impulse. It is this like biological thing, physiological thing of like, ugh, like I feel a pit in my stomach, or like I'm like leaning my body away from this person as they're talking, or like my lip is curling up as I'm hearing this. And so we can ignore these cues or learn to ignore these cues in these these disembodied spiritual environments. But when our spirituality is embodied, we actually get to use this superpower of listening to the wisdom of our body, listening to our own intuition and discernment, and getting to choose to act on that information, which is so, so cool. And to say this another way, embodied spirituality helps us stay connected to ourselves. So I can connect with others, I can be in relationship, I can be in community without having to abandon myself, which is, like we talked about before, what we get when we're in a spiritually disembodied space is, I have to ignore those cues. I'm not listening to my own voice. I'm not listening to what's good for me because I so want to belong, and I actually have to leave myself. I have to push that voice, that true voice of myself down, deep, 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 so I don't have to listen to her anymore because I just want to fit in. I just want to belong in this space, and she's telling me something that might threaten that belonging. But when we are embodied in our spirituality, we get to bring ourselves to a space where everybody gets to be themselves, where, we get to have opinions, we get to have choices, we get to say this space is good for me. Actually, it's maybe not as good for me, or this relationship is good. Oh, but maybe I need a boundary here. And that listening to our discernment and intuition in this way, as we do that, it only strengthens that relationship with ourselves and that connection and that ability to hear our true voice. And lastly, when our spirituality is embodied, it keeps us connected to the whole of life. So kind of like I mentioned before, this how embodiment connects us to our aliveness. When we're feeling into our own lived experience in the world, we actually feel a deep connection to plant life, animals, the land we live on, the bodies of water around us, the ecosystem we're in, the other humans, the other beings, the more than human worlds. Like we feel a sense of deep connection to life itself, to all the living beings around us that we interact with day in and day out, which, talking about meaning and purpose, talking about this sense of being connected to something bigger than you, like that is what spirituality is about. And so when we can practice our spirituality in a way that's embodied, it's doing what it's for, right? It's helping connect us to this bigger picture of where we fit in the grand scheme of it all, why we're here and what we're for. And for some of us, that may look very different, For some of us, it's nature. For some of us, it's God. For some of us, it's a certain theology or belief system. For some of us, it's love and connection and our people and our community. For some of us, it's activism and giving back. But practicing embodiment in our spirituality helps us to feel connected to the web of all life. And so to wrap up, I'm reminded of a quote by Cole Arthur Riley, who says, "If you aren't in your body, someone else is. The systems of this world have everything to gain from your disembodiment." Oof. I'll say it one more time. Cole Arthur Riley, "If you aren't in your body, someone else is. The systems of this world have everything to gain from your disembodiment." And another kind of person that comes to mind who talks about this a lot is Audre Lorde, who in her own way says when people are separated from their bodies, they're easier to control. And I think, what we just went through talking about when spirituality is disembodied and when it's embodied, like we see that, right? There's a separation from self that happens in these disembodied spiritual spaces that makes you feel like you have to choose between staying with yourself or staying with the community, staying with the leader, staying with the belief system. And what I mean by staying is like committing our loyalty to. And so I think, these wonderful, deep thinkers, philosophers, activists, are kind of these clarion cries of why embodiment is important in these spiritual spaces, but also in our society, in the political world, in our activism, because we're easier to control when we're disembodied. Because if you're not in your body, someone else is. These systems that want to dominate, that want to control, that want to keep people feeling powerless and small so that this small group of people at the top, the leaders, can have all the control and power. Disembodied people are easier to control in these ways. And so ultimately wanted to end with that because that's why we're here. We're seeing these power structures topple. We're seeing these toxic power dynamics within these organizations, whether religious or not, come to light. Things are being revealed, structures are falling, and we're going to be in a time of needing to rebuild some sort of system, some sort of structure. Maybe it's not as like rigid as we've had before, but systems will emerge to replace the old ones as they fall. And I'm not talking about like the government falling, even though could happen in our lifetime, but more like what I'm seeing in these religious spaces of like an old guard, a changing of the guard, if you will. Like the older leaders are kind of realizing like, ooh, we're caught. We haven't done a good job. And there's this new generation of like the millennial and Gen Z leaders who are stepping into these places and saying, we don't want this toxicity. We don't want this disembodied way of doing this. We don't want these like coercive power dynamics here anymore. And so I'm offering in that question that we're all kind of like, I think many of us are seeing and pondering and considering, where do we go from here? We don't want this. We don't want how it's been. But what do we want as an alternative? And I'm here to offer my 2 cents. I'm here to offer what I found fascinating and interesting and so needed in our society and in these spaces. Embodied spirituality. That if we can approach spirituality in a way that's embodied, that's connected to our humanness, that's connected to our real lived experience of being bodies in this world, that's connected to the web of all life, that's connected to our responsibility to each other's, preserving each other's humanness and dignity, maybe we can find a different way forward. Maybe we can have some of these spaces actually healing people instead of harming them. And I know so much goodness and so much healing can still happen in the church, can still happen in spiritual spaces, can still happen through politicians and governments and some of these other structures, even though they're getting harder and harder to find the good ones. But I think becoming more embodied in our spirituality is one of the tools we need for where we want society to head in the coming years. So this is why I'm creating this podcast for such a time as this. This is why I'm recording it now. This is why it feels salient and significant to add my voice in the mix. And going forward, a lot of my episodes won't maybe be as connected to current events. Maybe some of them will be, but I just felt like because of what's going on, I wanted to name that this is why we're here. So yeah, I hope you have enjoyed my ramblings and rantings about why we need spiritual embodiment. It's so fascinating and important to me to explore this topic, and I'm so interested to hear what you think, what's coming up for you as you listen. So feel free to comment on and share on our Instagram. I'm happy to interact with people. Spiritual Embodiment Pod on Instagram, and also, like I said, I'm a therapist for folks in California and an embodiment coach for everybody else outside of California. And so if this is something that's landing with you, maybe you're a spiritual trauma survivor, or maybe you've been a leader in some of these organizations and are, finding a path forward or figuring out where to go from here, and how to do spirituality in a different way. Or maybe you're just curious about your own journey of spiritual embodiment and some rituals and practices that you can take going forward to try to be more embodied in your spirituality, and want some added support for that journey. I would love to chat about that. So you can reach me through my email, which is in the show notes. I also kind of always have workshops and groups going on at some point. And so you can find all those on my website, samantharedondotherapy.com. Once again, thank you so much for listening. I'm so glad you're here. This is Samantha Redondo, and I'll see you next time. Bye.